Hello lads and ladesses. Let's do the answer to question 2 of the short answer assignment. This is really a comprehension question, or set of questions really. You're asked to read an article on the conversation by this gentleman here. This is Raja Janunka. He's a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales and an emeritus professor of economics at the University of Western Sydney. At Western Sydney University. Alright. So Raja is a macroeconomist, and he has written extensively on the problem of unemployment. So the first question about this article was whether empirical evidence was provided against the claim that rising youth wages was causing higher youth unemployment. Professor Janunka provides us with evidence which showed that was highly unlikely to be true. To quote from the article, youth wages relative to average weekly earnings have been stable or falling for most of the period, while youth unemployment rates have been rising. So, rising wages cannot really be the reason for rising youth unemployment. We can try and represent the argument that's being presented here with the graphical tools that we've been learning about. So let's put on the vertical axis the relative wage, that is, the youth wage relative to the average weekly earnings. And we'll put on the horizontal axis the amount of youth labour supplied and demanded. So we've got a downward sloping demand curve for youth labour, and we've got an upward sloping supply curve for youth labour. We've got that upward sloping supply curve fairly steep because what we're trying to indicate here is that the supply of youth labour is relatively inelastic. Most empirical studies seem to suggest that. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the relative wage rate for youths is quite high. Let's say it's above equilibrium. In that case, the demand for youths by employers would be at L1, whereas the quantity of labour that youths would be willing to supply at that wage, relative wage, is L2. We can see then that we've got the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and we've got unemployment of youths. Now, this is a fairly traditional kind of argument that's been made for a very long time. It's sometimes called classical unemployment, and so the argument is that it's due to a very high wage rate. Now, if we decreased the relative youth wage, we can see that on this argument, the quantity demanded would expand and the quantity supplied would contract. And so the oversupply of labour, or the unemployed labour, would shrink. The gap between quantity demanded and quantity supplied would shrink. So unemployment would fall. Professor Janunka is arguing that, well, yes, we see, let's say in the worst case scenario, a fall in the relative wage that youths would receive, but what we don't see is a fall in the amount of unemployment, contrary to what the model would suggest, which indicates there's something going wrong here, that this can't possibly be the explanation. This model doesn't explain what's going on. So what's another possible explanation? Well, one possible explanation is that rising youth unemployment benefits makes being unemployed more attractive to young people than working. So the question is whether there's empirical evidence undermining that, and Professor Janunka finds that to be the case. So he looks at what's called the replacement rate or ratio. This is a ratio of unemployment benefits relative to average weekly earnings. Now, the replacement rate, I'm quoting here, the replacement rate for young people has been falling since 1997. That is to say, unemployment benefits for youths have been falling relative to the wage that could be earned. So it means that being unemployed is progressively less attractive than being employed over time. However, youth unemployment rates post-global financial crisis have been rising. So if we were to put the replacement ratio, that is unemployment benefits relative to average weekly earnings, on the vertical axis, and we put youth unemployment on the horizontal axis, then we could say theoretically there should be a relationship, a positive relationship between the two. So for example, if the replacement ratio were R1, then the youth unemployment rate might be at U1, all other things being equal. But if the replacement ratio were to fall, so either unemployment benefits are falling while average weekly earnings are remaining unchanged, or maybe unemployment benefits are rising but average weekly earnings are rising faster, for example, so that the overall replacement ratio is falling, then we should expect choosing to be unemployed would be less attractive, and so the unemployment rate would fall, according to this story. Professor Janunka collects evidence which suggests that this is indeed occurring. The replacement ratio is falling. However, the youth unemployment rate is not falling. So this explanation of rising youth unemployment won't do either. The next question was, well, if that's the case, what reason does Professor Janunka offer for the rising youth unemployment rate? He states, well, first he provides some data which you can go and look at again in the article, which shows that it shows the adult unemployment rate, and on the same graph it shows the youth unemployment rate. And what is striking about that is that they tend to move parallel to each other. So Professor Janunka says, whatever is driving adult unemployment is also driving youth unemployment. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain why it is that they seem to move in parallel to each other. They seem to have a common cause. And he says, what is that common cause? The main factor driving the growth of adult unemployment, especially since the global financial crisis, has been a slowdown in the growth of aggregate demand. This has led to a growth of both adult and youth unemployment. An additional question we might ask, however, is, well, alright, that's fine, but why is it that the adult unemployment rate is lower than the youth unemployment rate, although they're moving parallel to each other, pretty much? Well, he offers this further explanation for the gap between them. Youth unemployment is more sensitive to the business cycle since a high proportion of young people work in part-time and casual work, and in industries like manufacturing, construction and retail trades that are most affected by a fall in aggregate demand. During a downturn, young people often end up on the receiving end of the last in, first out rule. The last in, first out rule being that young people are the last people to be employed, the last cohort, so to speak, to be employed when there's a boom, but they're the first cohort to be sacked when there's a downturn in the economy. And this explains overall why it is that the youth unemployment rate is higher than the adult unemployment rate, although both of them are ultimately due to the same underlying causal factor, and that is insufficient growth in aggregate demand. If we went back to this diagram here, which is showing the labour market, and let's say this is the adult labour market, but it could equally be the youth labour market as well. Let's say, just for fun, that this labour market were in equilibrium. That is, at the wage of W1, the quantity of labour demanded by employers precisely equaled the quantity of labour supplied to the market by employees or workers. So we have equilibrium, quantity demanded equaling quantity supplied. So that's all fine if its unemployment is not due to rising wages. Then how do we express this idea that there's insufficient demand for labour? Well, we might say that in the case of a downturn, instead of this here being the demand for labour curve, in a downturn, the demand for labour curve changes its shape and becomes something like that, which we could call an effective demand for labour curve. And what we're seeing here is that although it might start out the same at very high wages, it could be the case that the curve becomes vertical, that is, perfectly inelastic, indicating that employers are simply unwilling to employ any more labour than up to this quantity here. Okay. Why would that be? Well, if it's a downturn in the economy, there's insufficient demand for goods and services in the economy as a whole, and there doesn't seem to be any prospect that that's going to change in the near future. It would not be rational for employers to employ more workers. So we have beyond a certain level, L2. So we have a oversupply of labour or unemployment, but this unemployment is not due to the wage rate per se, but rather is due to a change in the effective demand for labour due to, for example, a recession or a downturn in the economy. And in fact, cutting the wage rate would not really be a particularly effective solution because demand is now vertical, perfectly inelastic. So if we cut the wage rate, there would still be substantial unemployment. It might decrease a little bit because at lower wages you might have less labour being supplied to the market, but the quantity of labour demanded and employed does not change. So cutting the wages is not an effective way of decreasing the level of unemployment in the economy. All right? What you would need to do is to engage in some kind of expansionary fiscal or monetary policy to increase aggregate demand for goods and services so that the demand curve would go back, so to speak, to what it was before. So you would get equilibrium with no unemployment in that case.